Everyone has taken a photo before, whether it be on their cell phone or another image capturing device such as a DSLR camera or an SLR camera dating back to the 1960s. But what a lot of people don't know is that there are three basics of a camera that every photographer should know about. The three components, otherwise known as the exposure triangle, consist of aperture, film speed, and shutter speed. In this speech, I'm going to be telling you about how to use these components effectively and how to better your picture taking and how to become a better photographer overall. The first thing we want to know about is the aperture. The aperture is the amount of light that is let into the lens when a picture is taken. Some cameras have the ability to change the aperture, but some don't, like a cell phone. Aperture is measured in f-stops. The lower the f-stop, the more light that comes into the lens, and the higher the f-stop, the less light that comes into the lens. Some cameras have an f-stop as low as 1.8, and this lets a lot of light into the camera. Some cameras also have a very, very high aperture, which is around 22 or 24, which lets less light into the camera. The lower the aperture you have, the more light comes into the camera, and the higher you have, the less light comes into the camera. Aperture also measures the depth of field or how blurry the background of the image is. If you have a lower aperture, like a 1.4, the background is probably going to be a lot blurrier than what is in front of you. But if you have a high aperture, more of the image is going to be in focus. The aperture is probably one of the most important components of the three-step process. Most cameras nowadays have a programmable aperture that you don't really have to worry about, but if you have an older camera, you might have to worry about it a little bit more. Now that you know the main components of the aperture, let's move on to the film speed. Film speed measures how fast your film is. Although most cameras today are digital, they still use this term because back in the day we had actual film. Film speeds can range from all the way down to 12 to 36,000. The lower the film speed, the less sensitive your picture is going to be to light, and if you have a higher film speed, the more sensitive it is to light. Light sensitivity is very important. If you're photographing something in low light, higher film speed is recommended, and if you're shooting something that has a lot more light, then your film speed should be a little lower. You should always be aware of your surroundings and to choose the most appropriate film speed for how light it is outside or how dark it is. Film speed affects the aperture because if you have a lower film speed, the lower your aperture should be to get the correct amount of exposure on your image. And if you have a higher film speed, you might want to use a higher aperture setting so you don't overexpose your image. Now that you have learned about film speed, let's go on to shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long the image is exposed to light. Shutter speeds can range from 30 seconds to as little as 1/2000th of a second. The lower the shutter speed it creates a longer exposure which lets more light into the camera for a longer period of time. If your shutter speed is high, this exposes the image for a shorter period of time and lets less light into the camera. Shutter speed works with the aperture and film speed in a few ways. If your shutter speed is high, your aperture should be lower and your film speed should be higher. If your shutter speed is low, your aperture should be higher and your film speed should be lower. Now that you know the three basics, aperture, film, and shutter speed, you should have a better grasp on how to take a better picture. Photography may seem a little difficult at first, but now that you have a little bit of knowledge on how to use these three functions equally and how to use them together, you should be able to create a better image. It all just takes a little bit of practice. One thing about image taking that I want you to know is that the more that you take pictures, the more practice that you're going to be getting, and the more exposure, no pun intended, that you're going to get to all of these three functions and how to better yourself in using them. Now, if you take pictures that you really enjoy and you like them and you don't have a problem with them, then good for you. But aperture, film speed, and shutter speed should always be main components in the back of your mind when you're taking a picture.